So we have preserved a half hour for discussion of the relationship between the Gulen movement and Gulen thought and the modern phenomena of multiculturalism, globalization, democracy, and how civility, piety, and ethics might play into all of this. So please come to the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Thank you. So we learned to run for this to have time for asking questions. Claes Grynell, my name, from Sweden. I was very intrigued by all the presentations, but my question goes rather to Mr. Robinson on the multiculturalism issue, of course. And you refer to Tariq Ramadan, which I also study, and I find it compelling. He talks a lot about the grounding for multicultural society and dialogue, and he has this concept, you might say, of patronizing tolerance, which he feels is too abundant. And this idea of co-creation or co-creators of society I find interesting and promising. My question is, how monotheistic is that? It works in this setting, but if we want to include people outside of monotheism, either atheist or other kinds of deist things, are you as positive in that setting, or?
Yes,
Thank you.
May I?
Yes.
I think it's certainly monotheistic. Creation theology, the people of the book can all share that. But I think it's equally strong in so-called secular society. You only have to look at Hans Jonas and his books on global responsibility, and you have a secular analogue. I'm not even sure if it's a secular analogue, but it is so parallel to much of that global responsibility notion or universal responsibility notion. Of course, it's not quite co-creation in the sense of responding to the creator, but it is certainly saying that we are responsible as co-creators for what's around us. It's a slightly more reactive than a proactive, but then those are fine distinctions. I think that theology resonates well beyond religion.
Hi, Özgür Koca from Claremont Graduate University. I would like to ask this question to Dr. Robinson. You talked about Gulen's notion of responsibility, which is universal. We are responsible from past, present, future, and towards everyone. But if such a notion of responsibility is internalized, it may also lead to a stressful life. How one can bear such a burden? How Gulen transcend this predicament? How does it transform into a joy too?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and there is no doubt that one of the parts. At one point, Gulen talks about the pain associated with that responsibility, and he's very close to Zygmunt Bauman at that point, where Bauman talks about the moral person can never know that they're fully moral. They've got to keep going. Now, so the question is that the route towards a neurotic breakdown? Yeah, that's the question, and that raises a huge question. It seems to me about altruism within religion, and certainly that needs to be put to Gulen. A good deal of what we're talking about is altruism. But I think you're referring to the question of joy in all of this, and Christian theologians would recognise the notion of eros there, alongside agape. Agape, the giving love; eros, the creative love. Now from that Christian perspective, I think one would recognise that God Himself, as He created, had that feeling towards His creation, and it was good. Wow, did I create that? Well, personally, it was good. So I think, but I'm sure. I mean, I'm not clear that Gulen has systematically worked through that issue of eros, but I am clear that at various points he does talk about self-care. I'd love to see more of the because creation mythology does require joy. I agree.
And if any of the other speakers want to jump in on any of these, that's fine. Go ahead.
Zeynep Elbasan from Indiana University. I have a question for Mr. Welton, Professor. So you said, like, Hizmet is understood best as a müsbet hareket. So I'm just wondering, how do we define the müsbet hareket? How do we define these positive actions? Or in which ways are these actions be evaluated as positive? Or what are the criteria, if there are, for this action? Thank you.
Thank you. That was, of course, one of many sections of the paper that I didn't really get to address in full, so now I have the opportunity to do so. Thank you. Müsbet hareketler, at least as I understand them, and this is based upon both the reading of Nursi, but also conversations, are defined as benevolent actions that are benevolent precisely because they are not self-interested. So it's not just the means of the action, it's not just the object, the end of the action, it's also the intention. The intention cannot be self-interested. And my understanding of Hizmet as service is that it coalesces quite nicely with that. So perhaps the best way to illustrate this would be to, there was a quote that I didn't read from a commentator on Müsbet, Aladdin Bashar. Let me see if I can find it here. He writes, so I'm quoting him, it's a nice way of answering a question always. If you build a house on what was empty ground and then offer it for habitation, that is a positive act, but if you destroy it and make it uninhabitable, it would be negative. Now there seems to be a focus on the outcome, but I would argue that also Müsbet hareketler and Hizmet require that there be no self-interest in that. So you might build a house for self-interested reasons, but if you do that, that's no longer Müsbet. This actually is quite important because I think it helps us to understand why Hizmet is not a political movement. I think once you're engaging in politics, you're engaged in the realm necessarily of self-interest, and this is a critique that's been made very explicit to me in some conversations I've had. And so that would help to explain some of this phobia of politics in a way among the Gülen Hareket, in that once you're in the political realm, you're leaving behind this emphasis on lack of self-interest.
This paper, which I did not quite finish, brings up politics intensely. Gülen talks about politics in the context of his own faith, but he is not focused there himself. He said, we will have to work out many of these things at a very pragmatic level, to use a Western term for it, in terms of how we actually do things. Because if we take on democracy, which is his central focus here, if we take on democracy, we will be taking on that whole province and have to take it on. Now, what can Islam do as a religion? We can inform that process. We cannot make it happen. That's kind of the gist I got from the author.
Hello. I'm Deb Biscu from University of Chicago, and my question is about Dr. Robinson's mention of the universal responsibility, but I'd like to hear from Dr. Walton too about what the situation is in Turkey right now regarding to that. Because what I understand is that universal responsibility includes our responsibility for everything past, present, and future. And in the past part of it, I don't think there's much room for agency, but certainly for accountability and liability. And I am wondering if Gülen movement had a specific stand on how that accountability and liability about the past, because it involves history quite a bit, ever. Did they say anything about it? Did they take a stand on how they're going to deal with that?
When you say the past, do you mean
past,
any specific past?
Oh, it could be specific, but in general too. How do we deal with past, and how do we address the accountability and liability in those terms?
Yes. Do you want to kick off? No?
Well, I'll make a more specific comment, which is that I think there's certainly an understanding of the past as potentially a liability, but also the understanding of the past as an opportunity. So this is something that I get to in yet another section of the paper on more on aesthetic ideals and the incorporation of some vision of the Ottoman Empire. This is not a political project by any means, but it is an argument that in certain aesthetic practices, the Ottoman Empire provides a seamless blending of religiosity, piety, and public life that's not available in contemporary Turkey. So there's this interest in resuscitating that. Of course, there's a risk with that as well, and perhaps that's where the liability comes in, because there's always a risk that you might fail in that project of resuscitation, or you might be misinterpreted as having a political project. So that's one way we could address that question. But.
And another part of it, how about the responsibility for the history itself on part of the Turkish state? Was that ever addressed?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I've not seen in Gulen any reference to that. So here's the headline: responsible for the past. It's a broad notion, from what I've read. I think the question now is, what does that actually mean? What's the payoff? What's the payoff? Now, if you're, we've all been through the old credit crisis, haven't we? And one of the key issues emerging from that, for many of the bankers, is how far were they responsible for the past?
Right.
And in particular, how far they were responsible for knowing about the past, and so being able to learn from the past. And it's quite clear that if you look at the credit crunch in the 10 years before that happened, there were at least 120 crises of exactly the same nature. And the only difference was that they were separate crises. They weren't the tsunami that we experienced, okay? But nobody took responsibility for knowing about that, the knowledge of the past, understanding it, and therefore learning from that. But then there's the question, as you say, liability. Whoa. That's a difficult one, that's moral responsibility in a more direct way. Now, I think Gulen should be quizzed on that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, I think there's one thing here implicit in this paper more than anything else. I believe Gulen is saying to his fellow Muslims, you must engage the past responsibly in your reinterpretation of it for how we're going to move into the future. So the way he believes he and his fellow Muslims must be responsible is to look to our past in a way that we can interpret it into viability today. That was at least what I found in this paper.
Because
it seems right.
From what I'm hearing, there can be two ways that one can address it. And one would be to look at past and invite everyone to look at it closely, analyze it, and take responsibility. And if we're liable, just go ahead and shoulder our liability. And the other one might be, in the same vein, just start with a clean slate. And, just bygones are bygones, and let's move on from here. So I was wondering where he was on this. But
we need our speaker on
quiz?
forgiveness to come up if we're going to do that.
Okay, all right.
I think
Wait
you wish
for
to
that.
quote
Thank you.
Gulen for us.
But I'm reading your book. Oh, let's see. Okay. Yes, okay. Sects, by contrast, resist accepting difference and diversity within themselves and resist accepting their interdependence with the outside world. They lack a solution for handling difference within complexity. Their totalizing appeal does not take into account that people are simultaneously living in the system interdependently. The Gulen movement does not deny the interdependence of the social field in its worldview, values, or actual organizational frame. It does not have a totalizing ideology that possesses and controls the social field, and it does not need to identify others and outsiders in negative terms. Page 145, 146.
The section about his quotation, like a quotation about history.
Yes. Oh, well, that's in the previous paragraph? Okay.
That was a
okay.
good statement as to why tariqat is not a good category, though. So it supports my argument.
Okay. Okay, now I have a quotation, but it's on the previous page, 144.
About past.
About the past. I'm looking. Okay. Okay. I'm trying to be quick.
While we're
about it.
waiting, perhaps we could get the next question.
Oh, yeah, get the next question and we'll
Go
see.
ahead.
I'm Nariman Safavi. I'm a private citizen and a businessman based in Chicago. I am wondering about in the Gulen discourse about diversity and pluralism, where does overt disbelief or agnosticism fall in? Because when you start to think about other Muslim theologians who are reformists like Abdul Karim Soroush, they introduce this concept of service. You know, their mantra is this Persian poem of prayer and worship is nothing but service to the humanity and no more. So they basically make an argument that some of the greatest Muslims of history are probably people who were disbelievers, but they committed the act of service to the humanity. So where does this concept of overt disbelief and agnosticism fall within this discourse of Gulen?
So that's for you, Rob.
I can field that, I suppose. Just on a very observational level, I would say that these are not questions that are raised very explicitly. So that fact in itself is interesting to note. But thinking a bit more about this ethical dispensation of Musbet and Hizmet that I was doing my best to summarize in the paper and then in the previous comment, excuse me, I think taken to a certain logical conclusion, Hizmet and Musbet don't focus on the object of dialogue at all. I mean, of course, there's always a partner in dialogue, but they don't focus on the nature of the object. I'm not going to be able to summarize this clearly, but there's an ethical possibility for incorporating anyone into that moment of dialogue precisely because dialogue itself is taken to be necessarily not self-interested. So the nature of the partner in dialogue, their own status vis-a-vis questions of religion is ultimately of secondary importance to the act of dialogue as non-self-interested in itself. That's how I would begin to answer that.
And Tom, do you have the
I
proper
have the
paragraph now?
quote, and it's been officially pointed to with the index finger. First, a statement to give it a context. Gulen emphatically refuses the model of citizenship that reflects a certain kind of racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity based on some often imaginary society in the past. And that was the context of our question. Here is his quotation. Of course, we should certainly commemorate the saints of our past with deep emotion and celebrate the victories of our heroic ancestors with enthusiasm. But we should not think this is all that we are obliged to do, just consoling ourselves with tombs and epitaphs. Each scene from the past is valuable and sacred only so long as it stimulates and enthuses us and provides us with knowledge and experience for doing something today. Otherwise, it is complete deception, since no success or victory from the past can come to help us in our current struggle. Today, our duty is to offer humanity a new message composed of vivid scenes from the past together with our understanding of the needs of the present. Spoke directly. Thank you. Thanks, Mohammed.
Go ahead, next question.
Hi, I'm Samuel Barry. I'm from the University of Georgia. I have a question for Dr. Walton concerning the history of Sufism, and the role of Nursi and Gulen in the history of Sufism, and concerning the question of the tariqa, whether or not it is one or not. We understand that Sufism, that the tariqas took a long time to form, and it was a very slow process, and they didn't have this sort of crystallization of hierarchy and organization in their first stages. And as well, considering the literal meaning of the term as path, as sort of a path to the presence of God, I would wonder whether Gulen's teachings and Hizmet is such a path to the presence of God.
Thank you. I think theologically understood, it's perfectly fair to identify the teaching as a way, as a tariqah in some sense. I should note that the broad history and diversity of Sufism is not an area that I have any particular expertise in, so I can't speak to that as well as certain other participants in the conference could. That said, part of what I was attempting to emphasize in the paper, and which I do more so in a section that I didn't read, but I'm going to read a passage from now because you've given me the opportunity, is the over-politicized nature of the term tariqat in the Turkish context, where it is purely an ideological term used to dismiss the Gülen movement and other modes of Islamic organization on the part of laicist secularism. So an example of this is from a piece by a woman named Ceren Coşkun, writing about the Turkish constitutional referendum, but I'll just quote her here very quickly. She wrote, I think this is a good example of this politicized use, even actors once close to the AKP and Islamist brotherhoods, that's tariqat, such as Hanafi Avcı, a chief prosecutor, have come out in defiance at what they see as the level of infiltration of the Islamist brotherhood, the Gülen community, in scare quotes, into state institutions. So here you have a description of the Gülen movement as an Islamic brotherhood, tariqat, which is explicitly paranoid, and there's a sort of simple arithmetic here. As anti-modern tariqat, Gülen sympathizers must be infiltrating the sacred domains of the Kemalist state and are totally illegitimate. So it's moving away from that ideological use of the term tariqat that I'm emphasizing in this paper.
Yes, thank you for a very invigorating panel, very invigorating. Cecilia Mowat here in Chicago with Strategies in Sight. And I have a couple of quick questions. As an attorney, your use of the term agency, Professor Robinson, as a free agent, I just want to make sure, because the legal mind that I have says agency is to do for others in part. So I'd like to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what agency is. And then in terms of the question that you started to raise of community versus movement, I'm very confused as a novice on Gülen as to whether or not this is solely an Islamic movement, or is this a community in action? And are we being co-creators based on the urgency of the situation, as John mentioned, the urgency of where we are? So if you could discuss that, because before I leave here today, I need to understand what this movement is and where to align other interfaith movements and other social movements as I go back to spread the word.
Mr. Robinson, let's begin with you.
Yes, indeed. Agency, the way that I certainly wasn't using it in terms of someone acting as an agent for somebody else, and as it's occasionally used in law and in business, of course, the agency theory of business schools. This was more around the notion of imputability, the idea of knowing what you think and being a free agent, knowing what you're about, and being aware of how your thoughts react with consequences and your environment and so forth and so on. So that's the notion of agency.
So thank you for that question. I'm really dealing with these concepts that are in some sense not solely internal, but specifically in a Turkish context. On the one hand, Cemaat, which is usually translated as community. On the other hand, Hareket, which is translated as movement. So I'll give you a narrative here of my own relation to these terms. For a long time, I always referred to Gülen Cemaatı, which is to say the Gülen community, because I thought that Hareket as movement presupposed this political logic, a movement toward an end. You usually think of it that way. And so I felt that movement wasn't necessarily the best category to describe what I was researching and experiencing. That said, again, I refer to Erkan Bey, who is perhaps in the room somewhere, I'm not sure. But I had this conversation last summer, which made me rethink this precisely because, well, on the one hand, Cemaat has become politicized in Turkey. That is, community has become politicized in the same way as tariqat was politicized as an earlier moment. So there's that aspect of the movement away from thinking about community. But then on a more theoretical plane, community seems to imply homogeneity and agreement among all members, whereas movement, at least in this Turkish context, this is, again, I have to emphasize that, whereas movement implies diversity, networks. You don't even have to be a Muslim to be a part of the movement. This was what the point of the quote that I read is about. So in that sense, I think it is a more appropriate category and concept to describe Hizmet. That said, I ultimately do move to saying that service is perhaps even better than both community and movement. So that's another conversation.
Hi, Elena Taylor from University of Chicago. My question is primarily for Professor Walton, but any of you could answer. I've heard throughout the conference so many times that the Gulen movement is not political, it's apolitical. And I understand that. My question is, to what extent, being a non-political movement, are they still involved in politics, specifically when it comes to enforcing human rights, the respect of human rights at a government level, and then specifically in Turkey, sort of buffering this hostility to religion. So how much are they involved in that, or could you say that the movement is emerging out of just a growing cultural acceptance of religion? So do you see what I'm saying? Is it the chicken and the egg kind of argument, or is there something we could really say about the Hizmet movement's impact on that political atmosphere in Turkey?
Thank you. I don't want to monopolize the rest of our time, but I'll try to be brief. It's not for me to define politics or the political once and for all here. Clearly, there are a lot of debates over how one defines politics and the political, but briefly, I would say that if you have the definition of politics as oriented toward influencing the state in some way, whatever the state may be, typically through partisan, political parties, but there are other ways to influence the state. That's the sense in which the Gulen movement is not political. They do not have any interest in influencing the state in any explicit way. On the other hand, if you define politics more broadly and generally to include influence in public life, then clearly there is a political aspect to the Gulen movement which relates to the emergence of, in some sense, multiculturalism and liberalism as possible political motivations and practices in Turkey that didn't, and this is the specific history of Turkey again, but this is a really new thing in Turkey, certainly datable to the 1980s in the first instance, but even more so in the last decade, 15 years. So in that broader sense of political as influencing public life, clearly there is a political aspect to the Gulen movement, but they are not political in that first sense. So that's how I would answer.
I think the paper which I read didn't quite finish that point. I think is a very valuable question because I've always wondered about Gulen, because he wants to absent himself from the political in that first sense, certainly. But he does write about democracy. And he believes democracy, in a way, is still in ferment, and I agree with him. Democracy is happening. It is not something that fell from the sky. It's a process on which we are still working. And he says not only that, but democracy is varied in different cultures. What can be called democracy in one culture may not be exactly what it would be in another culture. I think that makes sense. But he talks about democracy, and when you do, then you're going to be in some way political in the second sense that you use the term. So I don't think you can avoid it, and I don't think he tries to avoid it. It is not his work to work that out. It is his. He is very affirmative. He says, and is quoted in here as saying, democracy is the only serious option for the future. Now that is a strong statement.
And on that strong statement, we will end.
There you go.
Good man.